When you take all the information that you've gotten so far and you put that all together into the scene, that's what we call blocking out your scene. It's taking the ideas that you've come up with and now putting them down on the computer or down on paper so that when people can flip these images or they can see the movie file, they can get a really clear idea of what you want to communicate to them. It doesn't need to be polished. It doesn't need to have all sorts of information. To me, blocking is putting the least amount of information I possibly can up onto the screen to communicate my ideas clearly so that people can look at it and say, oh, okay, I know what you're going for here. You know, oh, that's really funny. Oh, this could be stronger. As soon as you do that, that's kind of communicating your ideas, and that's what we call blocking. So the three methods that we're going to be taking a look at are layering, pose to pose, and straight ahead animation. Layering in animation is breaking a movement down to its essential parts and just kind of starting out with just a basic movement and then layering more controls on top of that. For instance, animating a bouncing ball makes more sense for me to animate it in a layered fashion because I can think of that movement in terms of overall spatial placement as opposed to thinking about it in terms of key drawings or key poses. With this method, you primarily work with the curve editor, adding as few keys as possible and changing those few keys to get the timing and placement you want and building the performance out of that.
The layering technique is when you hide the limbs and you just have the body and the head as a simple bouncing ball. I only use it if the storyboards are really clear and the director is really clear what he wants, and I know I'm not going to be going back and forth as to what the performance is. The only thing that I really need to be focusing in on is making that physicality believable. I'll also use a layering technique if I have to do a naturalistic kind of animation when I was doing special effects and stuff like that, because to do natural motion, I find this, for me, is the best way to figure that out. I can do stylized animation, this technique too, but for the naturalistic kind of animation, I find, for me, this is the only way I can work.
Layering in animation can really let you get a performance in there quickly. If you do choose to do a layered animation, it's still utmost importance to have a clear vision and a clear plan of attack on how you're going to layer that performance into the computer. The general tendency with this method is to just jump in and to start moving things around and not having a clear idea. And this can lead to watered down performances rather quickly.
Pose to pose is basically create one pose and another pose, and then you create a breakdown, and then going between those poses is what you get.
This method was born as a traditional animation technique and was thought for a really long time to be too difficult to do on the computer. This has really changed in the last few years, and it really gives us 3D animators a chance to think about our work in terms of drawings, just like a traditional animator would. And from my experience, it's really helped push the work forward in huge leaps. When I'm working in this method on the computer, I like to treat every frame that I'm animating on like a drawing. So I'll set a key on every animatable control for that character, which pretty much locks down that image, or that image is a drawing. And then I can change it later if I want to, but at least I know if I go forward in time and make changes, it's not going to change the drawing that I've already created.
The reason why I choose to follow a more traditional route and path is A, because I was trained in a traditional method, so I am a traditional animator at heart, and I find it easier to break down motion, emotion, animation into simple images, into strong posing, concentrate on each key as an image or a drawing. And that's how I sometimes refer to keys as drawings, because in my mind that's what I'm doing. I'm moving images on a drawing to drawing basis and adjusting my animation in drawings. And again, that's more of the traditional background and thinking that goes behind my approach to animation.
This method, I've really found it helpful to work with step keys, because that allows us to treat it as drawings, and it doesn't give us any artificial in-between movement, because the computer likes to just give us movement for free, and that movement generally tends to be wrong. So it's important to not have that information in there and just have what you truly want to show and represent as your ideas for the shot, just through images that pop through, as opposed to having in-between motion. With this method, you definitely don't think too much about the curves at all, actually. You just think about the images and the drawings that you're trying to represent to communicate your ideas clearly. I personally love this method because it lets me focus on the key drawings, the key storytelling poses that I want to communicate to the audience. And then once I have that, then I can go ahead and add the breakdowns and in-betweens that I need to build the exact performance that I want to communicate. The tendency with layered animation is to forget to put things, and really important things, into the performance, like a twist or a bend in the body. And what happens is you get too far and it becomes really complicated to make those changes later. And with pose-to-pose animation, you have the tendency or the want and desire to put that twist and action into the pose immediately. So the performance usually wind up looking much more dynamic and much more clear, as opposed to layered animation feels somewhat stiff sometimes, because adding that motion again, it just becomes a huge pain. Pose-to-pose animation is really, it's a great way of working, and it's kind of bringing traditional animation into computer animation. And when I say that, it's treating each pose as a drawing, which we talked about already, but really it's working that method and kind of using the stepped keys so that it just pops from one pose that you're putting into the computer to the next. So really you're only seeing the information that you're putting in. And that's really cool, because it's really like you're working as if you're working on a drawing, and then you have another drawing that's maybe like 10 frames later or whatever. And it's a great way to work because it takes out all the computer calculations. It doesn't put any real in-betweens in there, because that's been a lot of the problem in the past with computer animation and having it be floaty, is that the computer does a little bit too much of the work for you. So it fills in the gaps, basically. So if you now take that stepped tangent and put it on spline, you know, it's going to start interpolating in between the two poses and giving you some movement that might not be exactly what you want. So when you're working in pose-to-pose, you're putting in the specific information exactly as you want it. So you put your key pose, which might be like this, and then another key pose, which might be like this, and then you can go in between and put your breakdown, which might be like that. So you get something that kind of looks like that. And without the computer doing too much work, you just have those three poses. You can get that you kind of get it popping, and you can kind of just see the movement and how it's working without the computer giving you any information. So it really makes you work like a traditional animator. And I think that method honestly is extremely powerful, because you're very conscious about exactly what's happening with your character, how the arcs are flowing, what's dragging, what's lagging, what's overlapping. And it's a way of working that has been extremely powerful, and it's a method that we really encourage you guys to practice and try out at Animation Mentor. My general tendency with this in the beginning was to want to see every drawing, as opposed to conceiving the overall flow of the movement. So in the beginning, my timing was totally off, because I wanted to see every drawing that I spent time posing out. But the thing is, no, you don't want to. Sometimes you just want to feel the movement. You don't necessarily need to labor on that pose, unless it's a hold or something. But in the beginning, you know, I found it really difficult, and it took some time to figure out the timing and how the timing works. And generally, my timing was off. It was much slower, because I was holding each drawing, as opposed to kind of moving in and out of the movement. And that just comes with experience and time. In the beginning, this method is kind of overwhelming to clean up. Why? Because you have a key on every single animatable object, and when you move around and start moving things around in the curve editor, it can become overwhelming really quickly. But if you just take time and patience to practice with this method, it winds up being extremely powerful. This method takes a little bit longer to block out, because you have to be 100% clear with your ideas. You can't really mess around, and that's the thing about this method that I like, is because it makes me think more before I start, and I'm kind of trapped into that mode of you gotta have a solid idea and a clear performance, because when you present your ideas, there's no hiding behind the computer or any free motion. It's all just 100% your idea is right there on the screen.